rates. A lot of times we forget about residual manure. And for those of you that may be working in nutrient management, you'll learn about that. Because there's still, if you keep adding and adding and adding and it's not being taken up, it's naturally going to build in the soil, and then without being able to grow a crop to utilize those excess nutrients, they're just going to build over time. So again, we can look at you changing our grazing management to be able to, again, increase our yield. So again, we can plant everything that we want to try to take up nutrients, but if we don't change our management to grow grass to use those nutrients, or grow a crop to use those nutrients, that that resource concern is going to remain. Okay, terrestrial habitat for wildlife and invertebrates. So again, do we have those habitat features out there? And usually what we use out there is called a WEG, or a Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guide. And essentially, the to say that we're meeting that resource concern or planning criteria, the score has to be a uh, 0.5. And essentially, we have wildlife habitat guides developed for every land use. So there's one for cropland, one for pasture, one for headquarters forest, and then we've also developed ones for associated ag lands, which is then broken down into uh, upland areas and riparian areas. So aquatic habitat for fish, this is where the SVAP really comes in. Um, and again, we're actually providing a training coming up to be able to use this assessment. There's 15 elements that we look at, and essentially, depending on what the scores are, um, if we're below these different scores, it's anywhere from a 1 to 10. And essentially, if our scores are basically a 5 or less, but some of these other different ones could be greater than, less than, or equal to 7 or 8. Again, using that evaluation tool is telling us whether or not we're having a resource concern related to habitat. Okay, moving on. Inventorying our resources. So when we work here, again, as I mentioned, first slide, the 9-step planning process. What we're going to work through right here, and this is what boot camp is all about, is the first 3 steps in that plan, in our NRCS planning process. And let's talk about an ag waste system. So looking at those nutrients on the farm. So again, our first 3 steps: identify the problem, determine the objectives, and inventory the resources. Typically, this is done as a team approach, and it's going to take input from the decision maker, the producer, you yourself as a planner with your expertise, and then you may need to involve the grazing specialist or an engineer to help you work through these first 3 steps. And the primary question is, why were we invited or requested to visit the farm? And typically, it's because the producer identifies that they have a problem. But then we also, as I mentioned before, we need to determine what their objective is, and then we have to develop and collect data of all those resources that's going to help us later to develop those alternatives. So, and that stuff is cow numbers, when do they spread manure, what's their cropping sequence, when can they actually, if we're going to put in a manure storage, when can we actually empty it and apply those nutrients to the land. Sources of information. A lot of times, we can look at the current conservation plan. In NRCS, we tend to hold on to information, and we may even have previous conservation plans, which are great because it might tell you for existing storages, if you can find that plan, you can see when it was originally put in. Is it past its life expectancy, or maybe operation and management hasn't been followed. We can also look at our nutrient management plan. Previous site visit reports. So has an engineer been out there before? Typically, we keep those on file for years and years, so you can see if you can find old trip reports or INEs. Talk with other planners in your office that might be familiar with the site. Obviously, we want to look at topo maps so we can see the contours of the ground, and then aerial photos. I can't stress enough about using aerial photos. If you have access to Google Earth, and you can use the timeline feature. A lot of those give you the most current photo all the way back to the 19. A lot of them have 1985, but you really can't see much. But usually, that's great to see how things have changed or how things have been managed over the years, starting in you find good photos starting probably around 1992, 1993. But again, great thing is so you can see the history of that site. Again, check the files. What old conservation plans are still in the office. A lot of our offices, like I said, hold on to stuff for a very long time, and you may find our old conservation plans from the 70s and 80s were in blue folders, and a lot of times you can find a lot of good information on what's been done previously, what's been discussed previously. But always check the files. You may be pleasantly surprised on what you may find. I was working on a watering system for a farm. They want to do a spring development. I found the old file from the parents, and I actually found the tile maps of where they put tile in back in the 70s and the 80s. So it was great. So we could say, oh, hey, now we know which tile lines we can tap into to kind of develop our watering system. So pretty cool on what you can find if you look in the files. A lot of different handbooks that are available to you, all the different resources. For ag waste, there's actually an ag waste field handbook. We have information in sections 1 and 4 of our tech guide. And again, you can pull all this information to find out how you can start developing alternatives to talk to that producer. Other thing too is don't be afraid to pick up the phone and call somebody who knows the site. An engineer might have been out there. You can call them, or if there's been another planner, say if you're with the district, you can call NRCS and say, hey, I'm working with so-and-so. Have you ever been out there? They might be able to provide you some information. But again, all good resources that are available to you. Talked about use of aerial photos so you can see what's been going on over the years. The biggest thing is identify who the decision maker is. A lot of times you get out on farms and it might be a father and son operation, but who is actually decision maker? Is it the son who's doing daily operations, or is it the father who's the landowner? So again, our discussions, we want to involve everybody, but again, ultimately, we need to identify the decision maker because they're the ones that are going to have to decide which conservation plans or what conservation practices and which resource concerns they want to treat, and those decisions go into our conservation plan. Can't stress this enough. Walk the entire site, okay? You may find times where people say, oh, well, you shouldn't spend more than an hour on a farm visit. I strongly disagree with that. You need to spend as much time that you need to be able to see the farm, find those different resource concerns, and be able to talk to the producer about your findings once you visited the farm. And again, you want to be out there walking the farm with the producer because, not only can they guide you to issues that they know about, but it's a good time to build rapport with them, to be able to build that trust and allow them to make good decisions based on the knowledge that you're presenting to them. But again, sure, we can show up to a farm, we can look out over the field, but do we know what's in every little draw or this if we don't go out there and walk the fields? Again, always document your findings. Take your notes. Take your notebook out there. Um, hey, everybody's got a cell phone these days. You can even we're even starting to use the auto dictation in the phones. You can talk into your phone and write and have it record everything that you're saying, and then taking photos. Because we don't always remember everything that we see from day to day, but take photos of what you're seeing. But the biggest thing is, before you start taking pictures, always great courtesy to talk to the farmer and say, hey, do you mind if I snap a few photos so I can help in developing these different alternatives. you know Again, looking at our because we're dealing with waste storage on this particular talk. Again, we have these inventory worksheets. A lot of our engineers will fill these out. Again, you can find these in section 3 of the field office technical guide, but again, it's a great worksheet that basically walks you through everything that you need to look at, and it allows you to document what you see in order to start developing your alternatives. The other key thing is not every operation is the same. What you may plan for a dairy operation may not work for a goat operation or a poultry operation. So again, knowing the type of operation that you're going to and what practices work for different types of operations can, you know, because again, like I said, what may work for one operation, what may work for cattle, is not going to work for horses, probably not going to work for poultry. So again, know what's available, what works for the different types of operations. And the size of operation. When we're doing conservation plans anymore, we're anywhere from big farms to now we're even in urban agriculture. So, the smallest of operations. Again, the different practices and the scale of different practices is going to depend on the size of the operation that you're dealing with. Look at your site location. Are you far from a road or are you near a road? Are you in an urban or a rural setting? What's the adjacent land use? That's going to have an impact on what you can plan. Also look at, over time. The producer may be looking at doing a progressive plan, treating something now and then moving to the next one down the road. So when we're planning, look at what opportunity you have for future um, practice implementation. And again, knowing your different setbacks, like if you're going to cite a structure, what does the local code say about how close can a storage structure be to a property line? How far from a stream does a structure need to be? So, knowing those required setbacks. Again, using your topo maps and your site visit, looking at, obviously there's going to be differences in how we plan our practices based on a flat site versus a steep site. Soils. I didn't get to hear all of Jen's presentation, but again, not all soils are the same. That shouldn't be a surprise to everyone. But knowing what kind of soils are out there, what are the natural features of the soils? Do we have bedrock close to the soil surface? Do we have deep, well-drained soils? What's the hydric properties of those soils? Again, that's all going to allow us to know the feasibility of doing the different practices on the farm. Yeah, knowing the geology of the area, if you're Lancaster County, we know that's big limestone, and we have issues with karst. Other areas, what is that underlying geology of bedrock and the different types of soils and how they're formed. Climate, that's a big topic over time. But again, from the climate is we're looking at, well, what's the effects on the length of storage? High rainfall areas might have to plan for that rainfall over time. Or when does the growing season start? When does it end? Do I need to plan a storage for 6 months, or based on cropping history, growing seasons, maybe I can get away with a shorter storage because I have more opportunity to empty that storage on a more frequent basis. Also affects the manure handling options. If you've got a lot of rainfall, you may be looking at a liquid storage instead of a stacking pad. And again, varies all around the state. We typically say Pennsylvania is about 40 to 43 inches of rainfall per year, but we know that that's highly variable across the state because I think it's Pike County gets up to 50 inches per rain, and then over in the Allegheny Plateau, there's other areas that may only get 30 inches of rain per year. So again, knowing that is going to help you when you're planning the different practices and the specifics of those practices. Okay, knowing the different crops that are out there. Again, crop scheduling needs to be determined so you know when you can apply that manure. If they're growing full season corn, your window to apply manure is greatly limited versus if they're doing a corn, bean, wheat rotation. If you have a nutrient management plan, you might be able to find that information in that plan of, what that cropping sequence is and that cropping rotation. And it could show a need for exporting or alternative methods of how to deal with that manure. Again, pasture systems, you know, what kind of pasture do they have? Is it a small amount of acres that are heavily stocked, or is it a big rotational grazing system? Obviously, how much the animals can be on pasture is going to have an impact on the sizing and the usage of the manure, and it may impact the type of practices that you're going to use. Biggest thing is, if we're doing these headquarters practices, we need to evaluate how are we going to move animals back and forth from the headquarters to the pasture. Labor availability. Again, is it just the owner and their family? Do they hire help? Do they hire seasonal help? Again, a lot of our practices, we want to be able to make them be able to use them and reduce labor. Looking at transfer equipment, again, because we're talking about waste storage options on the farm. Do we have scrape alleys? Do we need reception pits? Do we need different pumps? How are we going to get manure from barnyards into those storages? Determine what's existing on the farm. What's the status of them? Are they actually working? And what future purchases might be made. And a lot of times you may be working with a producer that is daily hauling, and the best way to treat the resource concerns with their manure is they need a liquid storage. Well, they're used to daily hauling. Do they have access to custom haulers to be able to empty that storage? And also looking at, well, if we do a liquid storage tank, how are we going to unload and apply that manure out there? Are we going to pump it to their own equipment? Do we need to hire a custom hauler? Can we use traveling guns and different types of other types of irrigation type equipment to empty those structures? Big thing, level of management. And a lot of times we can determine this based on what we see on the farm. Quick look at the buildings. Are they falling apart, or is the producer maintaining those? Look at their equipment. Is all their equipment outside or inside? Again, gives you that idea, allows you to start building, what's their ability? What's that producer's ability to operate and maintain the practices? So again, if we see that their level of management is pretty low, we don't want to plan a high intensity type of practice. So again, looking at more fail-safe for our lower managers. And again, looking at our animal housing methods, free stalls, tie stalls, you know, how are they managing it and what's going to work best for them. Again, travel routes. When we start planning some of our structures, if it's a dairy operation, you know, they're hauling milk twice a day or twice a week, still need to allow access to be able for the milk truck to come in and get to those practices. When we're filling silo, you know, how are they going to be able to get around that headquarters area with the practices that we're installing? And again, when we're moving animals, how can we move the animals back and forth and have good flow for other operations? Okay, we talked about laws and regulations. Big thing is do a little bit of research. Does the township require a land development plan? This is getting more and more prominent over time with a lot of the different regulations that are out there. As Frank and Nathan talked about, do they fall under a CAO or a CAFO? You know, are there other zoning ordinances that may impact how you're planning those practices or how you need to cite those practices? Again, how do they relate to Act 38? Are they required to participate or is it voluntary? In the nutrient management planning, based on their nutrient management plan, can they still apply to N-based rates, or are they restricted to only being able to apply on phosphorus-based rates? Are they required to have a conservation plan? On their larger operations, do they need these bigger permits and different plans? Of course, we talked about setbacks. Utilities, that's another big thing. Obviously, when we're planning these practices, PA1 call. If we need to bury transfer lines, do we have gas lines that we need to work around, or if we're doing different storages, power lines that are on the farm? Again, you may need to bring in a concrete pumper, but if you've got power lines all over the headquarters, that can be a pretty tough situation to be able to build that structure when you have to work around all the different utilities on the farm. And again, water quality issues. Our big thing when we're designing our practices is we're trying to prevent discharges in that 25-year, 24-hour storm event. And again, where our main goal is we're protecting our water bodies, streams, ponds, wells, springs. Big thing here is knowing if you've got streams, what is the designation? Because if you have an EV or HQ stream on the property, that definitely has an impact on permitting, especially if you want to do a stream crossing and how other practices that you're going to install. And think about the landscape resources. How's it going to appear to the neighbors? Because again, people a lot of times see with their nose versus their eyes. But again, where's the prevailing wind coming from? Where are those odors going to go? Existing tree lines. And then obviously we're going to start looking at about over time as operations grow, or if they're progressively implementing a plan, what's our expansion and flexibility? Consider their future animal numbers if they're going to increase. Space for feed storage, manure storage. Again, as we talked about, routing for being able to move around those headquarters. And sometimes you may have to bring in other consultants. I know some of our projects, we work with at Penn State Extension and their engineers. They bring a lot of good things to the tables. Talk to some of the builders that have been used in the past. All great resources. So again, wrapping up here, putting it all together, again, through Boot Camp 1, the whole purpose of this is allowing you to identify potential resource concerns, how to collect that data, and start developing those alternatives and present those to the producer. You may identify resource concerns that don't match the objectives and concerns of the decision maker, which is fine unless there's some regulations that say they need to take action. And again, how we resolve this, basically, as you keep coming through our different trainings, Boot Camp 2 would be your next step, and also some of the other trainings where we really dive down into steps 4 through 9 of the planning process. So with that, any questions? So I didn't get us out at noon, but we're only 8 minutes past noon.
There's nothing coming through on the chat, Dan. At this point, one last call. Any questions for Dan? If not, we will adjourn for today and get back together tomorrow morning here on Teams or whatever app you used and continue on with our presentations for that day. So, anything else? Think not. All right. We will see you tomorrow. Wait. Oh, thank you. You're welcome to everyone. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 8. We're free to go.
Paul, this is Jen.
Yeah.
I just wanted to verify, I'm doing my presentation on the cropland conservation tomorrow at 8. Is that correct?
That is correct. Tomorrow's schedule shouldn't be, it should go exactly as published. So
okay. And
do you have the agenda?
Yes, I do. I have a Word document with the agenda. And then following tomorrow's virtual day, then I will send you both presentations, slide sets, correct? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jen.
Bye.
See ya. Oops, cancel.